Hey folks, my name is Dustin Siggins. Thanks for joining us today. I'm with Proven Media Solutions. Today's election day in Virginia and New Jersey, and it got me thinking a couple weeks back about the importance of local media in politics, legislative agendas, and also in business, because with all the local news deserts that are happening, the Neiman Lab reported in July that 1,000 counties don't have at least one reporter in them. A lot of news deserts, but also it wasn't national media that created a real challenge for Democratic Attorney General candidate Jay Jones about his texting scandal. National Review reported it, but it was ABC 8 in DC that the local interview that really exploded it into making it more credible, despite the national media first putting it on the map. Similarly, we work with a lot of clients that it's not the national op-ed or the national person with the big name. It's that mom, the local doctor, the local business owner who's able to get into that local and regional press. So we're going to talk about local media's impact on elections. We're not going to talk politics. Local media's impact on the legislative agenda, because we have Owen here, who's a lobbyist. But then we're going to talk about its impact on business, because we have Dave and we have Jacqueline, who have both worked in and built newsrooms that have national impact, but also play strongly into local media markets. So if you all want to introduce yourselves, maybe Dave, Jacqueline, and Owen in that order.
Well, hey, I'm Dave Levinthal. Great to be with you. I am a contributing editor at NOTUS, which is a new news organization here in Washington, D.C., and I work with a variety of other publications as well: Columbia Journalism Review, Washingtonian Magazine, Fortune Magazine, Open Secrets, and others. I came from local news. That's where my career started. Launched at the mighty Eagle Tribune in Lawrence, Massachusetts, covering New Hampshire politics when I was right out of college at Syracuse University. And then I spent 7 years covering politics and government at the Dallas Morning News, based in Dallas, Texas, before I came to Washington, D.C. now 16 odd years ago. So local news is not only very close to my heart, but also something that in my current responsibilities, in my current capacity, I'm working with almost on a daily basis, because NOTUS as a newsroom works with a number of different nonprofit local news partners in particular to have a really, for lack of a better way of describing it, really cool relationship with the national level and the local level coming together and getting the best out of both.
All right. Well, I am Jacqueline Policastro. I am now the owner of Policastro Communications, so an advisor to so many wonderful clients. But like you, Dave, I am a former local news reporter. I'm a local news anchor. Here in DC, I built and scaled 2 television news bureaus from the ground up, covering the White House and Congress for local TV stations across the country, so providing content to more than 100 TV stations. I was also a trade association exec, but I think what's most relevant to our conversation today is that I am a true lover of local news.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Owen Caine. I am the Assistant Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the National Apartment Association, representing just about 20 million apartment units across the country. One of the reasons that I am here and I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel is that through my entire trade association life, I've always worked for consumer-facing organizations, which really rely on getting information directly to the people so that they can make informed decisions about the products they buy and the services they use. And before that, I worked on both local and national campaigns for about 10 years, where the closer you can get into talking to people, the better off you and your candidate almost always are, as opposed to anything else. And so very excited to have this conversation.
And for context, I've never worked in local news, not counting the one article I wrote right out of college. But Dave, I'm actually from New Hampshire. I didn't realize that you were a reporter on New Hampshire politics. My family's from Framingham, the Framingham area, and my parents live in Sandwich on the Cape.
I lived in Manchester and worked in Concord and got to see about every square inch of the state during my brief time there.
And my wife is from Texas. She would say that doesn't take very long in a state as small as New Hampshire.
Yeah, amen.
So again, what's really interesting to me is how for the last 10 to 15 years, we've been hearing about how local media is shrinking and news deserts exist. But it's still local media that people pay attention to. When Gannett changed their policies, Gannett being the parent company of USA Today, among many other outlets, about 8 years ago, they changed their op-ed policies. No longer would they take national voices as trying to shoehorn their way into local politics. We have found the same thing for our clients. Local outlets don't care about what you're saying nationally because they can find that anywhere. Their audiences care about how this issue affects this local area or the state from a local voice. And it still drives huge impact, whether it's because they're part of Gannett. They have a relationship with MSN or Yahoo or AOL for republishing, or whether it's because they work with someone like an organization like NOTUS, or they're working with Owen to make sure that that local piece gets bigger play. So we're going to talk from 3 different angles today. First, it's going to be elections, impacting elections. Then it's going to be impacting the legislative season, let's say in 2 months from now. And then we're going to talk how this can impact businesses. So Dave, you talked about the partnerships with local outlets. I'm familiar with the Center Square, which is center right.
Sure.
State's Newsroom, which I would say is a little further left than center left. And then Inside Sources, which is kind of down the middle. And they all are national organizations that have syndication relationships or reporting relationships that are designed to bring local national, but also make sure that national issues are more localized. Can you describe some of the organizations you're involved with and how local media impacts your job as a national reporter?
Certainly, and you could add ProPublica to that list, the national nonprofit news organization that has a fantastic network of local news organizations that work with them. But at NOTUS, we have something called the Washington Bureau Initiative, and what it is, and mind you, NOTUS has only been around for a little bit more than 2 years. It's a newsroom that's kind of been likened to a teaching hospital in the sense that we have a staff of tried and true professional journalists working right alongside 20 full-time paid fellows that oftentimes come from overlooked or non-traditional journalism backgrounds and are here in Washington, D.C. doing incredible work and also getting taught how to be a reporter in Washington, D.C. when perhaps they didn't have the opportunity. But as this applies to local news organizations, we now have a second wave after an initial first group of local news organizations, most of them nonprofit news organizations that range from the Salt Lake Tribune in Utah to several in California, Louisiana, North Carolina. We just added Wisconsin Watch in Wisconsin, Oklahoma Watch in Oklahoma, PA Spotlight in Pennsylvania. I could go on, but the point being is that there has been a great desire for localities and local news organizations to work with us because what we offer them is, in essence, a part-time reporter who can monitor their congressional delegation, who can write about news that's going to be of extreme and acute local interest to their readership and their news organizations, and give them something that is going to be difficult for them to just generate on their own, especially if they're working on a limited budget and are just trying to find enough reporters and journalists to cover their local region, say nothing about what's happening in Washington, D.C., even though the implications of what's happening in Washington, D.C., I think we need not state the obvious here, but to do so is profound for so many communities all across the country. So having somebody here in Washington keeping an eye on all of that type of news that does have those local implications is of great value to them. And we get to have the benefit of having our fellows who are learning on the job do incredible work that we know is going to be of benefit to local communities and is going to be a solution, even dare I say an elixir to the problems that have existed now for decades, which is the decline of local news and the shrinking and even disappearing of news organizations, and also to readerships that are not being nearly as well served in some cases as they were, say nothing about 30 or 40 years ago, but 5 or 10 years ago.
But the time of the conversation we're having today, how does local media allow you as a national journalist to be better at your job? So what I want to tie in, our audience here is communications professionals. So how can they be reminded that local media may be smaller than it was, but it's still really impactful? A lot of clients miss that part of the equation. They only want the national media. They only want the big trades, forgetting that if you're a franchise company, if you're private equity firm that is purchasing medical facilities, which is now a pretty common practice. How do you get ahead of that kind of thing? We'll talk more about the business side later, but I wanted to give an example. Does local media allow you to do your job better to get those good stories, to ensure that things aren't being missed nationally when they have local tie-ins, but there's 10 across the country that elevate its importance?
We're here in DC.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just
I
going
was
to add,
just jumping in for
yeah.
fun.
No. I'll stay out of it. I'll stay out of it.
No, Jacqueline, please go.
Well, I was just going to consider the trust factor. And I think this is the most important thing that we can talk about when it comes to local news. Surveys consistently show that people trust local news more than national outlets. And
Yep.
I believe that's because we're visible in the community. You know, as a local news anchor, I was reading books to school kids and riding on floats and parades and
Good point.
emceeing local charity events, right? And so the big differentiator is that we show up in times that are good, during the good times, and during the not so great times. So we're not just parachuting in. And I think that once you get to the point where you've earned that trust, you can now ask the really tough questions. I found that it's not even just the viewers that trust us more, it's also the folks we cover. So, you know, from the mayor of Flint, Michigan during the water crisis to the president during the pandemic, you know, when I'm there asking questions, I have sometimes better, if not different, access because I have that trust factor. And I think that's really important. Shines through my work definitely when it comes to my clients. And I think it's one of the most important reasons to continue investing in local news.
Yeah, I'll also add to that I think it's in an ever, I guess, shrinking world where everyone from politicians to advertisers, from news media itself, are trying to get down to the individual level. Like, how do we actually convince this person, or how do we find out what this individual is not just thinking, but what they're feeling and why? As that gets more and more targeted and more specific, I think businesses, politicians, any branch of the economy is going to want to take advantage of that, right? And local news provides this experience for people, that it is anchored and hosted by people who are members of their own community, no matter how big or small that is. But also, it allows individuals and organizations to get a much better understanding and be able to influence people in those communities to a much higher degree than, say, putting something on a major news network, if you can even get on a major news network. I think it also has the ability to amplify one's message, where that if you can find a community that's particularly affected by a situation or has a particular need in a situation, their local news is more likely to cover what you're offering as a solution or an explanation, much more than even the statewide news service is probably going to be able to do.
Something, Owen, that you just said really struck me because in covering Congress, I can't tell you how often a lawmaker would come up to my camera and say, "Oh, hey, Jacqueline, I want to talk to you because my mom watches this station." Right. And so, like, when you're talking about meeting people where they are and trying to find a specific type of viewer, I don't think anything explains it better than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Dave, one of the things that I found when I was a national, I was a blogger back when you could make a living blogging, and I mean, not much of one, but the thing I really liked about local news is that it had a different feel to it than, say, the national political media where I was part of, where a lot of times it would be that local outlet, either it was something broke nationally and the local outlet got the fine details. They would really get to the heart of it. Or something broke locally and it became national because it had the human interest story, the data, or it was the 8th local story in 6 different states on that particular issue. So when we're talking about elections, you know, again, election day in Virginia and Jersey, how do you find that local reporting can impact elections compared to national stories? Again, Washington Post breaks a story, it's big news, but that story disappears within a couple of days unless other outlets are bringing it down. But also local people, I mean, we care about the sidewalks, we care about the school. A lot of the stuff that's sexy in DC really doesn't break through the kitchen table issues.
For sure. And of course, we have big gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey, huge mayoral race in New York City, big vote in California that has massive
True.
implications for redistricting.
Yep.
But we're
Yep.
also forgetting too, and not much is being written nationally about the mayoral races all across this country and state judicial races. I mean, there are quite
Yeah.
literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different races in communities all across America right now. And in each of
Yes.
those communities, those races
Mhm.
matter so
Mhm.
much and likely matter to the communities in many ways more than anything that's happening at the national level in terms of the way that their cities function, the garbage gets picked up, the way that water works.
Right.
I mean, all of these local issues, you talked about sidewalks. Well, I mean, potholes and roads, it doesn't get more local than that. It's not going to be Donald Trump who's dealing with that. It's going to be the mayor and the city council and the city manager and the folks who have been empowered at a local level to make sure that that kind of work gets done. So as it applies to journalism, well, if you don't have somebody who is keeping an eye on those folks, both in an electoral context, but also to a governmental operations aspect, then that's when government can kind of run amok without a watchdog there to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And that's so essential. I covered Dallas City Hall for 6 years of my career. And if it taught me one thing, it's that some of the biggest decisions that do happen in individual people's lives were coming out of that building that I was going to every day or leaving to go into the community to understand what people needed and wanted so I could in a way be a representative, if you will, of various concerns in the community and talk to the local officials. I mean, Jacqueline said it perfectly. I mean, you have access to the people who have been empowered to make decisions. So it's incumbent on you as that local reporter to do exactly that. And just finally, at the national level, I mean, we're as national news organizations, of course, writing all the time about this decision or that coming from Washington, D.C., from the White House, from Congress. We're in the midst of a government shutdown, of course. What's going to happen with SNAP benefits and in different social programs, for example? Well, we can write that story that, well, Donald Trump said this or Congressman X said that, but it's going to be the local reporter in Topeka, Kansas, or El Paso, Texas, or Sacramento, California, that is going to write the story of how that national decision acutely affects the community. Without good local reporters doing that kind of work, be it at news organizations that deal with text or radio or television or whatever the case may be, the locality does not get well served. If you do have reporters in place who are doing that kind of work, you have a much more informed electorate, a much more informed citizenry, and you have a stronger community as a result of that informational IQ in a way being higher than it would be otherwise.
Here's another thing. We know that local news drives civic engagement. So communities that have strong local news coverage have higher voter turnout, more people run for office, folks in the community volunteer more. I believe that's because when we're telling local news stories, we're connecting people to actionable information that they can use in their communities. And I think that's a really important part of this discussion, especially on election day.
I would also, I completely agree with everything Dave and Jacqueline said. I would also say that I think it's definitely not a one-way street in that I think people who operate outside of local communities who have an interest in them need that connection too. And so like, if to your earlier point, Dustin, if I'm interested in buying medical facilities somewhere in some small town or in some small region, the opinions of the entire state or the tri-state area on that topic are of less importance to me than the actual place that I'm interested in going and attending. And I think it's through that local conversation and that informed public, to Jacqueline's point, that you're actually able to get those answers and get those more honest responses from the people that are dealing with the conditions in those places, as opposed to a national average in a nation that is very widespread on any issue, right? Because it just depends how it affects you directly. And I think politicians and businesses, but politicians especially, the first thing they're going to ask you when you walk into your office is, what does my town think about this? Or what do my constituents think about this? Or why are you bringing this to me? And why is it unique to me as opposed to anyone else? And I think local news is really the best way to get that information in an unbiased way.
Well, and Dave, you raise a good point. I'm a little embarrassed. Here I am. A LinkedIn post yesterday was about the Virginia election. I live in Virginia. It's certainly the one that I think that has gotten the most controversy and potential, sort of interest from the political class. But you raised a good point. There are local elections happening across the country, and I kind of lost sight of that for a moment. And it is those local reporters, to the public relations professionals watching. That's where you tell your client, don't go for that national media. They're going to be so busy covering the shutdown, Virginia, the Cuomo and Trump, and the race up in New York. But that local paper, that local online outlet is going to carry a great deal about you as the local mayor, as the councilman at large, school board member. So it really is so important in order to reach those audiences in that most niche way possible.
And to just offer up one example, the mayoral race in the city of Miami, Florida, hasn't been getting a whole lot of national attention, some, but it's this crazy race. The candidates are some wild characters. This is as lively and exciting a city as you're going to find in the United States. One of the most diverse. I mean, there's a lot going on in Miami, right? And it's also just so happens to be, if not the epicenter, very much relevant because Florida in general has become so much more relevant in the past couple of years, not just because of things happening at the state level, which have been very intriguing in and of themselves, but because the president of the United States is in essence, decamped to Florida and made that the epicenter of his political world. So this is all to say that there's been some incredible local journalism that's been happening in Miami around this mayoral race and the implications of it on the local community. And but for that, you would not have an electorate that was nearly as informed as it probably is going in about these candidates, about the issues that they care about the civic engagement and affairs of the city of Miami itself. And I fear for other cities that don't have that level of local media energy and churn that's going on in the best of ways that, in essence guarantees that every stone is going to be uncovered about these candidates and people are really going to know the stakes of what's going on here as they go to the polls and vote for them.
What's interesting about what Dave's talking about is it's essentially how I got the idea to build the television news bureaus. I was working for the Associated Press at the time, and I was up in the Capitol, and I saw that nearly every reporter was covering leadership. And there were so many lawmakers, literally hundreds of lawmakers working here in Washington, and no one was here to hold them accountable. And so, I pitched to independent television station owners, give me the opportunity to build a news bureau for you. I just can't stress how important it is to keep these connections to local communities going. It is what drives the ability to make positive changes for these communities and to hold elected officials accountable.
Well, and if you're in the public relations space too, one of the things that I often say is that it's really a PR professional's job is, of course, to make the client happy and do good by your client. But the way you do that is by making sure a journalist gets their paycheck this week. And you do that by getting the journalist a great story. So if you are the only public relations professional who recognizes what you're talking about, Dave, the way media works, right? The other candidates are over here doing these other things. And your candidate is the one talking to that local press, developing the relationship, understanding the rapport, and giving them news first. You're actually empowering local news. Yes, you're helping your candidate. Yes, you're helping your agency in the case of an agency supporting a candidate. But you're also empowering the local news by making sure that they have content that will keep the revenue coming in the door for those journalists. So 60 days from now, people are going to win or lose today. And Congress is going to come back, fight over a few things, big things over the next few weeks. But let's kind of pivot here to Owen and kind of let him take charge because he's the lobbyist in the virtual room here. So that's a good thing on this call, I promise. Sorry, we're not putting the branding on your forehead. So when it comes to the legislative discussions and debates, whether federal, state, local, what I have found really interesting is our public affairs clients, they're really happy to have sort of no-name people without public brands, and as the spokespeople for their campaigns. We got my last job before I started my company was with a trade association. There was some local issues happening in Arlington, Virginia, and Stanton, Virginia. And we got the Washington Post local page. I've never gotten an op-ed into Washington Post national. We landed 2 in the Washington Post local page when it existed, not because we had a national trade association and a VP and a big title, because the co-author was the local activist, the local pet store owner. And that person was more impactful for that audience. And that made it seem to make a big impact. So Owen, can you talk about how, when it comes to legislative cycle, whether it's state, local, national legislative season, regulations, how important is local media and regional media to impacting lawmakers? How much do they pay attention to that today in the era of social media and influencers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that there's a huge amount of attention paid to it. And I think it's because, again, it's that very specific viewpoint. It's a viewpoint under all the conditions that that particular legislator or regulator are looking for. And so if you're interested in what Fredonia thinks about something, you don't need an entire, continent's worth of data. You just want to know what Fredonia is thinking, right? And so I think we see that at the local level throughout this country. And to your point, no offense meant to any of us who I guess I'd call us all talking heads to a certain point now, but national commentators on large news networks who have a huge viewing audience and are able to distill large amounts of information into kind of salient details and important details very, very well. They give a very different picture of the same issue than a local news coverage would, because the local news coverage is going to be able to say, this is how your elected official is talking about this. What is your response? Or you're driving on these roads every day, Dustin, and there are potholes all over them. What do you think is the solution to this problem? And I don't believe I'm speaking out of turn in any way, shape, or form, but I think every elected official, if they aren't reading those articles and if they aren't trying to understand that sentiment, are doing themselves a disservice to begin with, because national ideas and national solutions are always going to be even slightly different than a local response to the same problem. And I think really local reporters also, to Jacqueline's point, have that ability because of the trust both with the elected officials, but also with the population that they serve, that they're able to ask questions both in a way that respond well to people, and thus the transfer of information is a lot more seamless, but they're also able to delve a lot deeper into very niche issues. And we see that all the time in the housing space. Obviously, most of our issues are local or state-run issues that our members have to deal with. And so while we try to find national solutions to those problems, even every day I'm reading the local response to whatever the housing situation is of the people I'm going to meet with that day, because that's where their mind is. And you can't even begin to have that conversation unless you have that understanding of their local population. So it's like I said before, it's the first question you're going to ask when you step into any elected official's office to do any kind of advocacy or lobbying work. They're going to say, why are you coming to me with this? Or why is this pertinent to me or my constituents? And local news is really where that's going to be covered.
Yeah, I spent many years of my career training reporters. I hired lots of reporters that came from outside Washington, and they worked in local communities. And now we were, part of the vision of the news bureaus that I built, which was to make local news national, bring it to the national spotlight instead of the opposite way, where folks that are reporting here in Washington are pushing content out to local TV stations. We want to elevate what's going on in communities across the country. But there always needs to be a human voice to a story. And we work really hard to find those people and to give them the space to tell their stories, because we know that the story is valuable, but it also gives the human touch to it. So whether it's, a member of the public watching the story or a lawmaker that's deciding whether or not to be influenced by it, it matters to have real people represented. And I think that you've seen over the past 10 years what happens when national media can be out of touch with what's happening in local communities across the country. That really helped me covering, especially the first Trump run to the White House, because I spent so much time in the heartland, in communities across the country, and understood that people really were struggling with the economy, healthcare, crime, social issues, right? And it's not as easy to see that when you're just not there.
And to that point, Jacqueline, I will say, I think that's entirely the way the system is supposed to work, right? These elected officials at every level are supposed to be responding to people's needs and wants and desires at a local level. That's the whole idea, is to kind of make it more personal. And that's probably never going to be able to happen in a country this large with large, massive national news media coverage. And so the way they're going to get those questions, to Jacqueline's point, in the way that reporters and local understand their people better and their constituents better, is by having those conversations and being in the thick of it all the time. And I think that's just a really great step that news media has made in the not so distant past, which is trying to, again, micro target these kind of decisions or wants or desires down to the local level, which again is what the system is based off of. It's supposed to be people responding to people in their hometowns.
And as we know, there was a time, not in the super distant past, where many local news organizations, they had a presence in Washington, D.C. They had a correspondent or even two or three. And then you had many national organizations or even large regional news organizations that had bureaus all across their state and even around the country. That hasn't entirely stopped and ended and come to pass. But it's so much different today than it is, 20, 30 years ago, for sure, which is why I will, given the opportunity, evangelize at every turn the national, local news organizations working together model, because it does get so much more out. You get so much more out of those partnerships than you ever would with the organizations working individually and separate and apart from one another. And, several years ago, I worked for the Center for Public Integrity, a national investigative news organization. Sadly, it is no longer and has disbanded. But during my time there, we constantly worked with local news organizations. I remember doing a story, spent 2 weeks in Fresno, worked with Valley Public Radio in California to produce a package that had great local and national impact and import, something that was incredibly gratifying because it hit really hard and way harder than it ever would have had we each individually been doing our own thing. So when you add this all up, you get better news when you work with local news organizations. And also for me, very selfishly, it helps me keep it real too, because the last thing I want to do is be in a Washington, D.C. bubble constantly and just, obsessed and taken over by everything that's happening inside the Beltway, which is why one of my favorite things to do every week happened this morning at 6:50 a.m. when I do a 10-minute segment with my local hometown radio station in my beloved Buffalo, New York, where we talk about national and local politics. I learn as much from them as they ever could learn from me. And it's something that really helps me, whether it's there or other local news organizations that I have occasion to work with, helps me understand what's happening in localities when we're talking about national big picture decisions.
Well, Dave, let's talk a little bit here about how to work with media. And Jacqueline, feel free to obviously jump in given your background, and Owen, how this applies as a lobbyist strategy. One of the things that I think is often missed, conservative candidates will often say the media is biased, and they'll just kind of dismiss the opportunities to work with media. And what I have noticed is that whether they're a liberal candidate working to get in touch with conservative press, there's Bernie Sanders going on Joe Rogan's show, whether it's a lot of times it's just simply developing the relationship. And I do think PR firms tend to overstate relationship to a degree, because it's actually about the story, not about who you know. But if you're the conservative Republican candidate, and maybe there's some inherent bias, right? Military people tend to be more conservative, journalists tend to be more creative or perhaps a little more liberal inherently. But if you have the relationship where, hey, I'm going to go to you with some facts, I'm going to go to you first with an exclusive story. How much does understanding how local media works and how those journalists work with their beat and their style, how much can that create rapport and relationship where everyone benefits, while also not trying to pretend like a local media reporter is going to do their own investigative work and isn't going to ask tough questions during an interview?
I mean, know who the heck you're calling on the phone or sending an email to. If you're taking a cookie cutter approach to your outreach, if you're on the PR end, don't be shocked when you get absolutely no response, because you're wasting a reporter's time. If you're sending an entertainment reporter stuff about politics or vice versa, or you completely misunderstand the type of news that somebody's covering, or you have no sense of their previous work, or even a clue about what they've done, or their approach or their style, then again, you're going to be disappointed. But look, I know a lot of journalists, and I can only speak for myself here, or will only speak for myself, but I'll talk to anyone. If somebody wants to talk to me and they have an idea, or they have a tip, or they have an exclusive, and it falls into my area of prime interest, which is people who are lying, cheating, stealing, betraying the public trust, doing something
Right.
untoward, saying one thing and doing another. I'm an investigative journalist, mostly, and want to do that kind of news. I talk to Republicans all the time. I talk to Democrats all the time. I don't have a horse in this race. If I wanted to be an advocate for one side or another, I would go into politics, or I would go into advocacy.
Right.
I choose to do journalism because that's what I want to do, and I see that as something where, it's very much about informing the people and telling them things that they don't know, and allowing our readership to be as informed as it possibly can be. So that's why you'll see me on Fox, and you'll see me on MSNBC and CNN. It doesn't matter to me so long as I feel like I'm doing journalism, and I know that a lot of reporters feel the exact same way. So yes, the fake news media trope that plays well in political circles, in some respects, but if you're really interested in getting your story out, then I think you are well served as somebody trying to work that end of the equation, to be open-minded about who you reach out to.
Well, similar to Dave, I'm very proud of my nonpartisan journalist background. But here's a factor that folks might want to consider. Even if you don't love dealing with the media, the local news, guess who does? The robots. And so we should care, because we know that AI is scanning local news specifically, and specific larger outlets as well. And if you want to get your message out there, yes, you can own parts of your own messaging platforms, but you can't own the media. We are nonpartisan. We do care about disseminating accurate information, and I'd argue that we're even more important now than we ever have been before. And the strains that reporters are under are so unique in 2025 compared to even when I started, right? About 20 years ago, which is that you're, constantly updating stories. You have lots of different platforms.
Yes.
Everyone's dealing in video and audio and live coverage. And so when it comes to making pitches, really understanding that you have to bring research and data with you, that you have to know the audience and the reporter, all of these things are really important.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And from from a trade association perspective, and certainly from a lobbyist perspective, and I'm lucky enough in my organization to have people who full-time do communications work and do press work and are able to help brief me and brief my staff about the proper ways to. But that information, and whether it's internal or you're having someone who help you, is completely necessary. To your point, Dustin, I mean, the amount of time that even I am encouraged to spend just getting to know reporters or just having conversations. It's not about pitching them something, and it's about being shown as having reliable information, or reliable and evidence backed up information that then they want to come back to and say, like, oh, what is the perspective of this organization? But unless you have those relationships, or have people who can, and who also are able to prep you in terms of, these are the types of things this community is facing. And so if you didn't know that, and you go in with the whole wrong perspective, or just not jiving with the perspective of the people you're trying to grasp the attention from, then it's not going to go well one way or the other. It's certainly for whatever you're trying to articulate. And so I think there's a certain amount of required back-end research and preparatory work that either you can do on your own or you can have people who help you do it. But I think making those connections and understanding, like all politics, how to connect with people in certain situations and how whatever you're saying might resonate with them, or cause them to kind of vibrate mentally in a way that will provide some sort of useful information, that's invaluable. I mean, that's like the whole game, because once you've worked out those relationships and you've worked out what your message is going to be, you're done. You just have to deliver it at that point. And so I think it's, having those people around who get it, including Dave and Jacqueline and yourself, Dustin, that really understand how to make those connections and how to interpret those, what I would call feelings more than facts. And how are you tapping into what people are feeling or trying to get them express what they're feeling, not just the fact of the condition around them.
And we've
Yeah,
talked a
yeah.
lot about lawmakers on this meeting because, of course, we're here in Washington, but it's really important for business leaders, high-level executives of large companies to small companies, to be confident delivering their message both to their teams internally, but also externally. And we've seen that viewers, that the American public wants to hear from these folks.
Well, and that gives us a nice pivot into the business part of the conversation. By the way, anyone who's watching, feel free to ask questions in the comments. We've got about 12 minutes left. Having spent so much time after college, I wanted to go into PR and marketing, but I graduated college in 2008. This little thing called the Great Recession happened, and there were no jobs available. So I ended up interning at a think tank in DC, and over the next few years got into blogging, as I mentioned earlier, and professional journalism. And it was so interesting to me. The first time a friend of mine from college, he has a health and wellness business up in just outside of Syracuse in Rochester, New York. A local article was run on them hiring a nurse. It's a 3-paragraph, 4-paragraph article. And I thought, local news still covers that? Because I was so used to the mudslinging in DC. I got published probably 3,000 times in politics, and maybe a tenth of them have any staying power past that week, and I didn't realize that at the time. And then locally, I see so many articles on the school, the sports, the literally the sidewalks, and it reminded me that, oh yeah, that's right. I got kind of caught in that Beltway bubble to a large degree. In fact, I got accused of that by a former employer, that I was too Beltway. I was covering, Social Security and Medicare. And they cared more about the sexy items that were actually going to drive headlines, they're activists that they were involved with. But when it comes to businesses, my friend's business got coverage because they hired somebody. And we are the one space that's gotten a lot of attack is the PE industry for buying up real estate, for buying pediatric practices, dental practices, etc. And I think that whole
News stations.
yeah, right.
Yep.
And I think they're really suffering from a lack of understanding of the importance of local media. Having that the doctor, the owner of a practice who for 30 years has been running the back end and hated it, is now outsourcing the back end, has more cash, and can now focus on patient outcomes. That's a great story for that doctor to go out and tell the local community. I think they're missing a lot of opportunities for that in the small business world, and even the big businesses franchising, expanding, or otherwise trying to enter a new regional market.
Yeah, and I will add to that I think there was a time, and probably predates this conversation a great deal time ago. But I will say that there was a time when I think a lot of businesses felt that advertising or kind of paid information would just suffice. And if we just told you what we wanted to tell you at any level, everything will be fine. And I think there was almost a fear for business, especially in the advocacy space, but a fear for business in general, about being put in the seat of answering those questions live by anyone, let alone a local person who may not seem as nuanced or as experienced. And so I think the trend, luckily, has been that I think businesses, as they go into local communities, have this need to be responsible and answer questions from the local community. But I think that's a new phenomenon, and I think it's rare. Was rare back in the day that if a private equity branch was buying let's say, a medical facility in a local town, that they would even think that, like, what does the local community think about this? They'd just be like, I'm going to come here, I'm going to make money, I'm going to provide a good service. Everyone's going to love me in the end because everyone's going to be happier, and I don't have to worry about it. And I think it's a net good thing, but it is a reality that you have to be willing to have these dialogues as a business with people who you consider your peers or your competition, as well as people who are just taking in your services and figuring out if they like you or not, because all of that information moves across the country very, very quickly.
Data centers are a great example.
Data centers.
There's so many data centers, in Virginia, data center central. Locally, out here, about 90 miles west of DC, there's, again, I don't know anything about data centers, but I read a local article. I didn't realize the 3 data centers that they were going to put, talking about putting south of town. It's 11 buildings. It's hundreds and hundreds of acres. Well, maybe there's some NIMBY, but maybe there's a real concern about what that level of construction and that level of infrastructure is going to do to the small town that my wife and I, like, our kids live in. So to your point, you can't just come in anymore and do it, because now everyone has access to social media. Now everyone can slander you, slam you, criticize, legitimate or otherwise, and you have to be that proactive.
That's right.
Yeah, people have more ways to make their own voices heard in their communities and outside of their communities. And because of this, you see more businesses getting comfortable or working to get comfortable talking about how things that are happening in the community or the country at large, whether it's trade policy, for instance, are impacting the way that they do business or the cost of their products. And really being able to know that folks have more access than ever to information about your business, whether it's your earnings calls or the owned content that you put forward. And they have an expectation that businesses have a voice. And again, we've seen this when it comes to social issues, especially, but also now when it comes to how things impact the economy and folks' bottom lines.
Silence also breeds skepticism and suspicion. And if a reporter calls you and you're not answering back, then we're going to keep digging. And it's something that is irresistible to many reporters, which is when you're trying to engage with an entity. It may be a business, it may be a governmental entity, a politician, a lobbyist. It doesn't matter. Fill in the blank. But if somebody is just refusing to talk to you, engage with you, have a conversation with you, help you understand their perspective, then they really do so at their own risk, because we're going to do the best job, or I know myself and my colleagues, we're going to do the best job to get the most up-to-date, accurate, fulsome information that we possibly can get. But sometimes a puzzle piece just simply isn't there, and it's not because of anything we're not doing, but because some aspect of the story that we're writing just refuses to engage with us. It's up to them. That is their perspective, but there is a big risk that sources take when they decide to take that route.
Absolutely. That's why I love advising companies dealing with different types of challenges, because you don't have to know everything about the business to know what a reporter might ask. It's actually great to have someone with an outside perspective in the room who comes in looking for information that the average person might also be looking for, or that journalists in the community or nationwide might be looking for. It's really important to be prepared for discussing things that, again, are positive, but also difficult for your company or your organization.
And said similarly, a similar way to say that, I think, is business especially should look at these opportunities as a way to change minds, not to declare edicts. And I think for a long time, local news, but just interacting with local people in general, was business just declaring something and just saying something was going to happen. And I think we've seen a change in that over time, but in the business front, especially, and especially in consumer-facing businesses like I've represented, you're going in there with the hopes of changing people's minds to agree with you. not to tell them that you're right necessarily, or above all else, you're right. And I think that requires a certain amount of bobbing and weaving. It requires a certain amount of compromise, and it requires a lot, as I said, of prep work and understanding who you're talking to, all of which I think would be in different ratios and different amounts if you were speaking to CNN or someone like that on a national level.
Well, and something you just said, Owen, that we've all mentioned, I think it's all obvious to us, but I think it's worth saying explicitly, is your end audience with the media is always the end consumer.
Yeah.
Whether you want to vote, whether you want someone to send a letter, whether you want someone to support your idea or buy your product. At the end of the day, the media certainly is providing value, but the person who wants to access the media must remember that end audience as well. So you can't just send Dave an email with a bunch of generic sounding data. If he's working with local press, it has to be, how does this tie to this area? How does this impact this community? And do it proactively. Because again, as Dave said, that reporter might get some information and go, that's not a complete story. There's something missing, and dig into it. And reporters should do that anyway, but in a time when they're pressed, the more information that you can get them on the front end, the better off everyone was going to be.
And I will say to that, just as a brief story to exemplify that, there are many businesses that I have worked with, and even some that I have worked for, that thought it was a great idea to alert a bunch of local reporters or a bunch of reporters about all the good stuff they were doing, and sent a pre-form letter. And it was just, we did all this great stuff and everyone loves us and you should talk about it. And then were shocked when they got questions back. Like, how could you disagree with all this amazing things we're doing? And they found themselves right in a hole, right? To Dave's and Jacqueline's earlier point, which is that then they didn't want to say anything because they felt if they answered the questions, they were somehow digging themselves into a hole. And so you're right. I mean, this isn't one of those things that I think business especially should do willy-nilly and should just figure out like, oh, I can speak to 1,000 people and everyone's going to love me. This is about a conversation and about a way to change minds, like I said, not a way to just inform people about how great you are or what you need them to do.
And to Owen's point, we're a selfish lot, journalists. Okay, we want exclusives. We want to beat the competition, and competition is very real. Okay, so if we can have a conversation with somebody who has information that could potentially be valuable to us as a news organization, so that we can report it exclusively to our viewership or our readership, that's going to instantaneously be more valuable than the information that is going to be blasted from on high in a press release that goes out to every last person and in the area in all media. Also, too, and this is just me, different reporters are going to have different perspectives, but if time is available, I will always prefer a face-to-face conversation more than I will prefer a Zoom call. And I will always prefer a Zoom call more than a phone call. And I will always prefer a phone call more than an email. And I certainly will always prefer an email more than nothing. So if, keep that in mind. Try to understand, if you're going to be communicating to a reporter, how they may want to consume that information or how they may want to connect with you. Some reporters are just going to love to text with you, and that's going to be the extent of it. Or Signal. If you're not on Signal, that's something to keep in mind as well. But having a connection is very important to me because I want to be able to trust that other person, at least at some level. I want to know if they're going to be, full of it and feeding me a line. If they're disingenuous, run the traps about who they are and who they're representing. And some of the best sources I have are ones that I've known for 5 or 10 or even 20 or more years, because we have built a rapport and I understand them and they understand me. And you can have a source reporter relationship based on that and foster it.
So we're going to close here in a couple of minutes. And what I'd like to do is actually pivot to a question from Derek. And I'm actually glad he asked this because it's kind of the elephant in the room for anything related to media these days. What do you think is the impact of social media conversations on local news areas? Is it something that reporters look for to support stories? I actually had a conversation about this, not about local news, but on the show probably 6-8 weeks ago. And my point of view is that social media is overrated for getting into the press? Because we've gotten a lot of people interviewed and op-eds published with no real brand. They're not really on social media. But I suspect, Dave, you might have a different point of view, or Jacqueline, when you're trying to comb for stories, you're actively searching to see what that hot topic is and how to do that reading on Reddit or the local Facebook pages and things like that. So can you all speak to how, kind of wrapping up here, how social media plays a role in how local media finds information and then is able to validate it as either at least a point of interest and importance, if not actually a credible piece of data to move forward with?
We definitely care about what our viewers are saying on social media and other platforms throughout the internet. I vividly remember being a breaking news morning reporter in Indianapolis, probably around 2010. And it was the beginning of when we would, we would come in the middle of the night at 11 p.m. and we would scan to see what people were talking about. And it also gave us the ability to interact with our viewers throughout a several-hour morning show. And it was the first time in my career that we were using social media in that way. And now, of course, that's just expanded and amplified based on all the platforms and the different ways that we can communicate video and audio and talk to pretty much any source anywhere in the world through this video platform. And so it's, for me, it's absolutely been relevant. I think it matters what happens online.
Yeah, different at the national level than the local level, but I would say, especially from talking to local level journalism colleagues in the business, that some of the social media platforms that you might not think of in your first thought, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, the TikToks, like go to some of the other one. Nextdoor, for example, is just an incredible repository of insanity that's going on in communities. I mean, not to put too sharp a point on it, but much of what you're finding at the most granular local level is being debated and discussed in real time with photos, with videos, and lots of people with lots of opinions, all on that platform, not replicated on any other social media on a kind of consistent basis nationwide, but at the local level. So thinking in those terms and being aware of places that aren't obvious is pretty central to the conversation around how does social media play into local news.
And I guess I would just, I have always tried to exercise a certain amount of caution with social media, at least news coming in with social media. I think it is it's an outstanding series of applications and the ability for individuals to put forward information that would otherwise be incredibly hard to be consumed by a large amount of people. That said, we do live in a society like news itself where bad information tends to spread, or negative information tends to spread a lot faster than positive, especially when it comes to business interests. And I think you always have to be, I see local news as a validator of things that are brought up in social media in their local communities, because yes, one person might have a problem or a benefit that they are passionate enough about to bring up on their social media account. But it really is whether that is indicative of a larger group of people or that is just this person's feeling. And I think it's local news that's able to take that and match it with their understanding or the opinions of more people to understand if that's a growing trend or if that is just, this person is particularly happy or unhappy. If we based all news off of the most popular social media posts, it would just be kittens and puppies all day, every day, right?
Hold on, and Trump's tweets.
And Trump's tweets. But I think the benefit of those kind of local news media is being able is that they can be like, oh, I know this person, or like, yes, this is a problem that other people are facing too, not just that they can't get their cell phone not to work, which is what I use social media for at any given time. But like, and so I think it is they complement each other well, but I always exercise caution with social media because one person really happy or really upset about something anywhere in the world does not a trend make necessarily.
Wait, my opinion doesn't matter, but I put it on social media.
Exactly. Well, it matters to me, certainly, Dustin, but other people.
Exactly. Folks, this was a lot of fun. Dave, we hadn't met until about 2 hours ago, so thank you for coming on with a complete stranger.
My pleasure.
And Jacqueline, it's such a pleasure to get everyone's perspectives here. I really appreciate it. And any last things you want to close on?
Gosh. Okay, I got one for you. We have
Okay,
the
I'm ready.
second.
I'm ready.
What we were just talking about, social media goes into the what I call the Jimmy Kimmel effect, right? Do you remember when this happened? And then we saw that there was an override of national programming at the local level and showing how, local stations can be community gatekeepers. And so I think that that's just a good thing to kind of end on and think about how that trickles down to other storylines and when media is thinking about, hey, how do people in my community actually feel about that? I'm going to make a broadcast syndication decision based off that.
I will say just in closing that, and this is not a planted statement, I promise, but for the other panelists on here that do a lot more of this kind of news work on a day-to-day basis than I do in my career, it's so important for those watching and for those listening that you have someone that you trust who knows about this industry to talk about things you're going to do in them before just going and doing them. And it seems like a very simple process that you just like make a phone call and talk to a reporter. How tricky could that be? Like, and then they're going to print stuff. But it is more complicated and it's more nuanced than that. And it is based on personalities and people's feelings about any number of issues. And so if you don't have a Dustin or a Jacqueline, and someone like Dave who's in this business, most people in my experience who are reporters, who have been reporters, are happy to talk about how that process works and how they find stories and things like that. So, if you can hire a professional to help you do it, several of which are on this call, that's great. But I also think you have to tap into the people who operate in this space before just trying to jump into it full force.
Well, and this is a planted statement because I'm the host, but we call that the 3 T's. The right topic at the right time from someone with the right title. And title usually has C nowhere in it. And so that is always going to be my planted statement on this show. So, folks, this was great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks.
Enjoy the fellowship. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.